the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Ryan and I have lived in Atlanta for, 15 years now. And one of my first friends in Atlanta was a professional organizer. Do you all know this profession? It's a very first world sort of profession, and that it helps people create more efficient and organized systems for managing their abundance of possessions. So what they do is these professional organizers, they assess their client's need, and they kind of develop these organizing solutions that are customized with strategies to implement, all to reduce clutter and achieve a more streamlined and stress-free environment. And what made my friend Amber particularly in demand as a professional organizer was actually not her attention to detail or her problem-solving strategies. What made her an in-demand organizer was that she had been a hospice chaplain. You see, she said most of her work in this field was actually not about organizing, but about being present with people who were grieving and letting go. Sure, the labeling and storage solutions were one level of engagement, but helping people manage the emotions of parting with possessions was a deeper, higher calling. And now I know many of you are dealing with parting with possessions. At whatever time in your life that might be. That might be leaving for college, or that might be moving into an independent living facility. But this engagement with parting with possessions, well, I have a tip for you. One of the strategies that my friend used, she said it worked really, really well. And that was that you pick one object from your collection and you imbue it with significance, with sacredness. So for example, if your hobby was to collect a spoon from every town or country or city you visited, and all of a sudden you have 500 spoons that will not go with you to your dorm room or your independent living facility, what you do is you pick one and you allow it, you give it the sacredness and the significance and the meaning of all the other spoons, and then you let the 499 go. It's a trick of the trade, but we already do this naturally, don't we? That baby book that holds one or two items from a childhood full of things. The retirement gift, a watch or a clock that sits on the mantle, distilling 40 years of work into one respectable item. Or what about the wedding picture that sits on the mantle that represents all the photographs, festivities, dreams, memories, hopes of that particular day? We are distracted by the number of possessions we have, and sometimes distilling it down to one is a good technique. I've used it myself actually around the COVID-19 pandemic. As regulations were loosening up and the numbers were looking better, I was faced with an abundance of masks. Now, I could have tossed them all out, and I did toss out those N95s, even had this yoga material that was supposed to breathe really well. I had a branded one from the church that I worked at the time. Tossing those out felt great, but I did keep one mask, and I still have it in my drawer. And this one symbolized all that we had gone through with COVID. Deep breaths as we remember the PPE, the cleaning of groceries, the online schooling, the drive-through testing, the social distancing, the deaths, the funerals we had to miss, the struggles, but all also the strength, the courage, the creativity, the resiliency of this significant season in all of our lives. So I knew that tossing away all those other masks was getting rid of the distractions, but keeping that one was a reminder of the main thing, the love and the faith that ultimately brought us through what was a terrible season. That mask is still in my sock drawer, and yes, it does have Dolly Parton's picture on it. And now that you have this professional organizer's trick for too much stuff, let's turn to the gospel and see what Jesus has to say about our accumulation of goods, of possessions. Well, in the passage for today, we have two scenarios packed into this small pericope. First, a man from the crowd yells out, asking Jesus to weigh in on the inheritance distribution between his brother and him. So the Judaic inheritance practice would have been that the older brother receives 2/3 of an estate, and the younger would receive 1/3. So presumably the speaker who's not happy is the younger son, who wants his fair distribution of the resources. And so he yells out to get this great teacher to side with him. But Jesus declines to be the judge. Jesus says it's not his role to take sides. In fact, it is Jesus' role to tell you a story. And the parable that he tells goes like this. There was a rich man, and his land produced abundantly. And this man, he accumulated more and more crops, so many that he decided to tear down his old barns so that he would build bigger ones to house his grain and his goods. And then the rich man says to himself, "Soul, relax. Enjoy the fun future that is prepared for you by this accumulation of goods." Well, then, the story goes, the man's life is demanded that very night. And the question is, well, then, to whom belongs this accumulation of goods? Not him, not anymore. So whose were they in the first place, is the question implied. He is a rich man, but in the end, Jesus says, what does it matter? You store up treasures for yourself, but the question to be asking is, are you rich toward God? It's a good question. It's a good question that plays well in church. Maybe you've heard this passage before. The preacher gives you an encouragement that you can't take it with you, and so you should give to the church, right? It's a stewardship Sunday sermon extraordinaire, this reminder that we can't take it with us. But there's more to this passage. And actually, when we place these two stories in their context, we get an even more in-depth and actually, I think, more interesting understanding of Jesus' words. I'm using a man named David Schauffer here to unpack this passage. He's an Episcopalian priest. I read him in the series Feasting on the Word. And he says, of course, yes, Jesus, in Luke's gospel especially, is interested in economics. We certainly see that. But this passage is not really about interest and dividends, planning for retirement, and proper estate planning, as much as we would like it to be on Stewardship Sunday. Instead, this passage is about the distractions of possessions, the distraction of money. When we put this text in context, we see that Jesus is actually just coming from Mary and Martha's home. You all remember this passage. Sally preached on it recently. And in the story of Mary and Martha, Jesus goes to their home and he receives the hospitality from the sisters. Mary prays at Jesus' feet. Martha handles all the logistics, and there's tension between the siblings. And in this case, it's about an imbalance of the duties. Perhaps we might even say there's injustice because the work is being done with Martha carrying most of the load, and so Martha complains, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." I kind of love the chutzpah of this man from the crowd. "Jesus, you judge for me of Martha. Tell her to help me." There's a fairness that they're seeking to find, and they want Jesus to weigh in. But again, in this passage, Jesus declines to be the judge and land on Martha's side. The text tells us that Jesus tells her instead, "You are worried and distracted by many things." Our commentator says Jesus' comment is to show that in the press of the immediate perceptions, Martha has lost perspective. In her multitasking, Martha has missed out on her one critically important vocation-centering obligation. Martha has missed out on the main thing. So in context, something similar is happening with the men in our text today. The first man who comes to Jesus with his fairness complaint, and it may be, in fact, it probably is, that the brother is being treated unjustly according to the inheritance law. But Jesus declines to address that concern, as good as it may be. In fact, Jesus says it is not his role. And instead, he calls out that man for being greedy, for missing the main thing. And then he tells the story of the rich man in the parable who has such an abundance of goods that he builds bigger and bigger barns to secure his future. But again, Jesus' role is not to weigh in on the dimensions of barn building, the fact that the man is accumulating goods. He doesn't talk about retirement planning. He doesn't call out the man for being rich. He calls him out for not being rich toward God. The people in this text and these stories, they've lost their perspective. And when it comes to money and goods and resources, losing our perspective about what is central in our lives is easy to do. How many conversations are you all having about inflation or the stock market or the state of the economic world? It is easy to do. But our commentator says this: the issue for Martha, for the discontented brother, for the rich man, and for us is careful discernment regarding various dimensions of value. Such discernment, such dimensions are challenging when money is at stake, and it can be even more difficult when the presenting problem involves a fair distribution of capital and labor. Perceptions regarding both are often immediate and intense. Perspective is essential in discernment and often hard to come by. Which is why Jesus has so many stories about the distractions of money. There are many parables where Jesus unfolds stories of distraction in which characters take tragic, foolish actions, devolving from their misuse of the resources they've been given. There is the rich man and Lazarus. Do you all know this one? It's intense. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus tells the story of a wealthy man who lived luxuriously while a poor man named Lazarus suffered at his gate. They both die. Lazarus comforted in Abraham's bosom. The rich man tormented in Hades. The rich man is unable to cross the chasm between the two realms, and he asks Abraham, warn my brothers back on earth about the consequences of their actions. But he is told that his brothers already have Moses and the prophets to guide them. They already have what they need for a life well lived, but they had gotten distracted. And there's another story, a parable. It's told from a slightly different perspective. This is the parable of the 10 pounds. This one's a little different. Jesus tells a story in which a nobleman gives 10 pounds to 10 servants to invest while he is away. Upon his return, he assesses their performance, and he rewards those who have multiplied their pounds, and he punishes the one who did not. The man who buried his talents misused his goods. He was distracted again by the threat of a tyrant landlord. He didn't trust in himself and in God's future for him. And then there's this one, the parable of the wicked tenants. It's a doozy. It tells the story of a vineyard owner who rents his vineyard out to tenants, and they work hard and they produce well. But then when the vineyard owner sends servants to collect the fruit, the tenants beat and kill him. The owner finally sends his son, but the tenants kill him too, hoping to gain the vineyard. They are so caught up in keeping it all that they murder the beloved son. Talk about the powerful pull of the distraction of our goods. And those are just parables from Scripture. We have stories in our lives as well. How the accumulation of resources, money, possessions leads to poor decisions. How about the siblings who have a falling out when their mother passes away? One believes that they did not receive a fair share of money from the sale of the assets, and maybe that sibling has a point in light of the time she spent caring for her mother when she was ill. But then the siblings argue, and things turn ugly, and there is name-calling, and accusations are flung, and decades-long connections are cast aside, and future relationships between the subsequent generations are ended because of these destructive actions. Or how about that one where the young parents set their sights on a lifestyle that will clearly articulate the American dream to impress upon their family and friends that they haven't made, and yet they do not have any time in the hyperproductivity of their world. They do not sit down to eat. They do not even buy their own groceries. Their social outings are about getting more business. They work while they are on vacation, and the relationship cannot survive the disconnection and the strain, and they spend years and much of their savings in a litigious divorce, trying to divvy up the distribution of their assets on a plan they can both agree. There are more and more stories, parables from our lives, where the distraction of money and goods and possessions takes over and destroys. So our commentator reminds us again, in the discernment of various dimensions of value, it can be hard to have perspective. But there is one value above all else. And Jesus in our text reminds us today. In all of these stories, Jesus is clear and direct to the humans involved. When he addresses the man who speaks up out of the crowd, worried about his inheritance, demanding justice, get involved, Jesus says to him, "My friend," and tries to pull him out of this distraction. And then when Jesus responds to Martha's complaint, which again is real, He addresses her instead by name. Martha, Martha. There are other things. Even in the parable story, God speaks directly to the character. It's more straightforward, more jarring here, because God says to the rich man, "Wake up, you fool." There is only one question we need to be asking. What does it mean to be rich toward God? What does it mean to be rich toward God? And for lives filled by the journey invited in this question, may we be truly grateful. Thanks be to God. Amen.